The small town of Garcia, Nuevo Leon, was quiet, almost unnervingly so. It was a place where the world outside seemed distant, a place where news from afar took days to arrive. But on that day, the news hit hard, with a finality that no one could have anticipated. It wasn't the usual tragedy of an accident or a random event. This was personal. This was the loss of a bright star. A star that had been born right here, in this humble town. The news rippled through the small community in an instant, echoing like a distant thunderclap. The man who had spent every waking moment of his life watching over his daughter now had to do the unthinkable: pick up the shattered pieces of a life that had been cruelly stolen away. Humberto Estrella, her father, sat in silence. It was all he could do. The man who had once guided her first steps, taught her how to ride a bike, and heard her voice crack through the radio airwaves was now the man who had to identify her name on a list of victims from an air disaster. In that moment, everything seemed to blur together as he grappled with the cruel reality of a world that had taken away his daughter. Débora Estrella wasn't just a famous voice on the news. She was his little girl. The same girl who had spent hours on the floor, drawing pictures, imagining the world around her. The same girl who once cried at night when things weren't right. To the world, she was a well-respected, hard-working journalist, someone who seemed to have it all together. But to Humberto, she was more than just that. She was a dreamer, a person filled with hope, yet someone who was also filled with fear of letting people down. Her career had been marked by success. From university radio to national television, Débora had quickly become a trusted face on the news. She had earned her place, but Humberto knew the truth. Behind her confident voice and poised demeanor on screen, there was a person who doubted herself at times. A person who struggled silently with the weight of her responsibilities and the loneliness that often accompanied her rise. But even with all of that, Humberto could never have imagined that his daughter, the one he had watched grow and prosper, would be taken from him in such a tragic way. He could never have prepared himself for the moment when he would find himself holding on to memories, knowing that they were all he had left. Débora Estrella's life was shaped by a childhood that had the weight of both privilege and hardship, an intricate dance between expectations and her own aspirations. She was born into a family that knew the value of discipline, but also one that showered her with love, providing her a unique balance between structure and freedom. Humberto and his wife had always known that their daughter would soar, but they never imagined that her flight would be so high and so fast. Her early years were marked by a natural curiosity that couldn't be contained. At a young age, Débora would spend hours observing the world around her, asking questions that were often beyond her years. She wasn't like other children. While other kids played outside, Débora had her nose buried in books. She would ask Humberto how radios worked, why stories were told the way they were, and why words mattered so much. Her father, a man of few words, found it hard to keep up with her constant stream of questions, but he saw in her the same thirst for knowledge that had once driven him. He nurtured that curiosity, allowing her to explore, to seek answers, even when those answers took her to unexpected places. Her passion for communication was obvious from an early age. Humberto remembered the moment when she first expressed her desire to become a journalist. It wasn't a passing thought. It was something Débora had put serious thought into. "I want to speak the truth," she told him one evening, as they sat in the living room of their home, the light of the setting sun casting a soft glow over her face. "I want people to hear it and believe it." Her father, ever supportive, told her without hesitation, "If you're going to speak, speak the truth." Those words became Debora's guiding light as she made her way through life. She didn't just want to be heard. She wanted her voice to have weight. And so, she poured herself into everything she did, knowing that her voice had the power to change minds, to educate, to reveal the truth. By the time she was in her teens, Débora had already made her mark in her school community. She joined the debate team, entered journalism competitions, and volunteered for the school newspaper. She didn't just participate, she excelled. Her teachers recognized her talent, often saying that she had a natural ability to connect with people through her words. But beneath the accolades, Débora carried a deep sense of vulnerability. She was constantly aware of the pressure to succeed, to meet the expectations of her family, her teachers, and eventually, the larger world. Her path to becoming a professional communicator was never an easy one. In college, she faced the kind of challenges that many students encounter: late nights, demanding professors, and the constant balancing act between work and study. But for Débora, these obstacles were never an excuse to falter. She threw herself into her studies with a relentless drive. She sought internships, worked for the university's radio station, and honed her skills until she was ready to step into the professional world. But even as she achieved what many people only dream of, a nagging feeling lingered inside her, a fear of failure, a fear of not living up to her own standards. Her family saw this struggle, but they never spoke of it directly. Humberto, especially, noticed how Débora would retreat into herself after a tough day at work. She never complained, never let anyone see her frustration. But he knew her better than anyone, and he could see the toll her demanding career was taking on her. The long hours, the constant rush to meet deadlines, the public scrutiny. It wasn't easy for anyone, but it seemed especially hard for Débora. She had always been her own toughest critic, and now, as her career took off, the pressure only intensified. As Débora climbed higher in the world of journalism, from local news stations to national broadcasts, her professional success brought a new set of challenges. The demands of the industry were relentless, and though she loved what she did, the loneliness of her work began to settle in. Humberto watched as she began to change, not in her values, but in the way she dealt with the stresses of her life. There were still moments of joy, moments when she would come home from work and talk excitedly about her latest story, about the thrill of uncovering the truth. But there were also times when she would come home exhausted, her face drawn and her eyes tired. She had achieved so much, yet the world demanded even more from her. Through it all, Humberto remained her quiet supporter, watching from the sidelines, proud of the woman she had become, but aware of the toll it was taking on her. He knew that the world saw Débora as a professional, a strong, reliable figure on television. But at home, she was still his little girl, the one who would curl up with a book or laugh at something silly on television. He cherished those private moments, knowing that they were rare in the life she was living. Still, Débora continued to push forward, never asking for help, never showing how difficult things had become. She had a dream, and nothing would stop her from achieving it. She had a purpose, and she would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. Humberto had always known that his daughter would soar, but he never imagined that her flight would take her so high, so fast, and so far. The transition from a young, hopeful student to a full-fledged journalist was not an easy one for Débora. It came with moments of triumph, but also moments of profound internal struggle that few could see. Her path, though seemingly smooth to the outside world, was layered with complexities that only she could understand. She had entered the world of broadcast journalism with the kind of determination that only the truly ambitious possess. Her voice was now one that people trusted, a voice that greeted the nation each morning, a voice that brought the news directly into homes across Mexico. But it was also a voice that carried the weight of immense pressure. There was always an expectation of perfection, something that Débora held herself to with unwavering commitment. She worked tirelessly, often staying late at the studio, refining her delivery, making sure that each sentence she spoke was precise, that every word she uttered resonated with clarity and impact. Her professionalism was unmatched, but it came at a price. Behind the perfect exterior, Débora was often battling feelings of isolation and doubt, something that only her closest family members knew. Her father, Humberto, had watched her transform before his eyes. The confident young woman who had once walked into a newsroom, eager to make a name for herself, had become a seasoned anchor, an authority on the news. Yet, there were moments when she would return home, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the world, her mind tired from an endless cycle of deadlines and expectations. Humberto knew that his daughter had always been driven, always sought to do better, to push harder. But now, he began to notice something more. There was a distance, a strain in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. Debora's dedication to her work often meant sacrificing her personal life. She had few close friends outside of her colleagues, and when she did make time to see them, it was always on her terms, dictated by her busy schedule. The balance between her career and her personal life was delicate, and at times, she felt like she was losing control. There was no time for the simple pleasures that she had once enjoyed, reading a book uninterrupted, going for a walk in the park, or simply sitting down to a leisurely meal with her family. Every moment was accounted for, and it wasn't enough. As Debora's career progressed, so did the scrutiny that came with it. She had become a public figure, not just in Monterey, but nationwide. She was the face of news programs, the voice of reason in a world that seemed to be spiraling out of control. But with this fame came a new set of challenges. The constant public attention, the demands from her audience, the expectations of perfection. It began to take its toll. Débora found herself questioning everything. Was this the life she had imagined for herself? Was this the price of success? It wasn't just the demands of the job that weighed on her. It was also the toll it took on her mental and emotional well-being. In a profession where showing vulnerability was often seen as a weakness, Débora kept her struggles to herself. She couldn't afford to show cracks in her armor, not when so many people were watching. She had learned from a young age to hide her emotions, to put on a brave face and keep going, no matter how exhausted or overwhelmed she felt. But there were nights when it became too much to bear. On one of those nights, after a particularly grueling week of work, Débora stood before her mirror, looking at her reflection. The exhaustion was visible in her face, her eyes bloodshot and tired. She had been pushing herself harder than ever, yet there was no end in sight. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, her inbox overflowing with requests and deadlines. She felt trapped, confined by the very thing that she had worked so hard to achieve. Her inner turmoil was made worse by the fact that no one could truly understand what she was going through. To the outside world, she was the epitome of success, a woman who had made it, who had fought her way to the top. But inside, she felt lost, uncertain, and empty. The pressures of the job were relentless, and she often found herself asking if it was all worth it. But there was no time to stop and reflect. There was always more to do, more to give. It was during these moments of doubt that Débora began to turn inward. She had always been someone who sought answers within herself, and now she needed to find a way to reconcile the woman she had become with the person she had once hoped to be. She began to question her motivations. Why had she chosen this path? What had she truly wanted from her career? The answers, however, remained elusive. One day, while reading a news story about a tragic incident, Debora's perspective shifted. She realized that life was fragile in a way that she hadn't fully understood before. The world had a way of taking things away in an instant, and she had spent so much of her life working towards something that now seemed so uncertain. Was it worth it to continue down this path of endless ambition, or was there more to life than the pursuit of success? Her thoughts began to circle back to a desire she had long suppressed, her love for flying. It wasn't just a passing interest. It was something deeper, something that had always been a part of her. She had dreamed of being free, of soaring above the pressures and constraints of her career. The thought of flying gave her a sense of peace, a moment of escape. It was her way of reconnecting with herself, of finding the freedom she had longed for. Débora began to make plans to take flying lessons, something she had always wanted to do but had never found the time for. It was an act of rebellion, in a way, a defiance against the pressures of her life, a way to claim something for herself. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of excitement and hope. She wasn't just chasing a dream anymore. She was embracing it, fully and without hesitation. But as the days passed, Debora's life took a dramatic turn. The pressures of her work, combined with the weight of her personal struggles, had reached a breaking point. She was no longer just a public figure. She had become a symbol of something much larger, something that would change the course of her life forever. The news of Debora's tragic death sent shockwaves across the nation. The entire country seemed to stop, frozen by the heart-wrenching loss of someone they had grown to trust and admire. To the world, she was a journalist, a figure who had dedicated her life to uncovering the truth, to informing the masses. But to those who knew her intimately, to her family, her friends, and her colleagues, the loss went far beyond the professional. It was personal. Humberto, Debora's father, was left in a state of disbelief. In the wake of his daughter's passing, his life felt as though it had been split into two distinct realities, before and after. Before, when Débora was still by his side, with her contagious laughter filling the house and her dreams of flight still on the horizon. And after, when the house was eerily quiet, when the familiar presence of his daughter was gone, leaving only the hollow emptiness of her absence. In the days following her death, Humberto couldn't escape the questions that plagued him. How could this have happened? Why had Débora, a woman who had worked so hard to carve out a place for herself in the world, been taken so suddenly? The accident, a plane crash that took her life, was a stark reminder of how fragile life really is. In the span of just a few moments, everything could change. All of the ambition, all of the effort, the dreams of a future yet to be lived, gone in an instant. The media coverage was extensive, as it always is when a public figure passes away, but Humberto could not bring himself to watch the endless streams of news reports. Instead, he spent his time in silence, reflecting on the life his daughter had led and the legacy she had left behind. It was impossible for him to avoid the overwhelming grief that consumed him. The loss was immeasurable, a pain unlike any other. His heart ached with every thought of what might have been, of the moments that were now forever lost. In the midst of his mourning, Humberto couldn't help but notice the reaction of the public. While the country mourned the loss of Débora the journalist, the woman who had informed, educated, and inspired so many, Humberto felt the sting of knowing that the world would never fully understand the depth of who she was as a person. They knew her as the confident anchor on television, the trusted voice delivering the news. But to him, she was still his little girl, the one who had once cried in his arms, the one who had learned to ride a bike with his encouragement, the one who had chased her dreams with an intensity that left him both proud and fearful. Her colleagues, too, were deeply affected. They spoke of her professionalism, her dedication, and her drive to be the best in her field. Many of them had worked alongside Débora for years, and they had seen firsthand the toll that her career had taken on her. She was relentless in her pursuit of excellence, always pushing herself further, always seeking the next challenge. But as much as she gave to her work, there was a side of her that was often overlooked, the side that was vulnerable, that yearned for something more than the grind of the news cycle. Her friends remembered the moments when she let her guard down. They remembered the times when she spoke of her desire for something beyond the news desk. They recalled how she often spoke of wanting to fly, not just in the figurative sense, but literally. Flying was something that had always intrigued her, something that represented freedom and escape from the pressures that weighed her down. It was a desire she had kept mostly to herself, a secret dream that only a few people knew about. But now, in the aftermath of her passing, Humberto couldn't help but think about that dream. He wondered if she had ever truly achieved the freedom she sought. He thought about the flying lessons she had begun to take, about the excitement she had felt when she was in the cockpit, the sense of accomplishment and joy that had come from learning something new. In many ways, that passion for flight had been her way of reclaiming a part of herself that had been lost in the hustle of her career. As Humberto continued to reflect on his daughter's life, he realized that her death had left a void that would never be filled. The family that had once been whole was now broken, and no amount of time would ever change that. The pain of losing Débora was something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. But as he sat in the silence of his home, he also realized something important. Débora had left behind a legacy, one that went far beyond her role as a journalist. She had been a woman who had fought to make her mark on the world, who had overcome obstacles and doubts to achieve greatness. But she had also been someone who had loved deeply, who had cared for her family and friends, and who had never stopped dreaming. Her life had been a journey of self-discovery, of constant growth and change, and even in death, her story continued to inspire those who had known her. The world would continue to mourn the loss of Débora Estrella, the public figure, the journalist, the voice of truth. But for those who had known her as a daughter, a sister, a friend, her legacy would be about more than just the work she did. It would be about the quiet moments, the small acts of kindness, and the dreams that she had pursued with unwavering determination. It would be about remembering her as more than just a face on the screen, but as a person who had truly lived. As the days passed, the world outside continued to spin, unaffected by the void that had been left behind by Débora Estrella's passing. The newsroom where she had worked for so many years moved on to the next story, and the nation, as it always does, shifted its focus to the next tragedy, the next headline. But for Humberto, her father, the world had come to a standstill. The grief that gripped him was deep, more profound than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just the loss of his daughter, but the loss of the person she had been, her spirit, her passion, and her dreams. In the quiet of their home, the absence of Débora was felt in every corner. Her laughter, which had once filled the house, was now replaced by a silence that echoed through the walls. Humberto would find himself standing in the kitchen, waiting for her to come home, just as he had done so many times before. He would absent-mindedly pour a cup of coffee and place it on the table, as he had for years, only to be reminded, painfully, that she would never walk through that door again. But as he sifted through the memories, as he let himself mourn the loss, Humberto also began to remember the parts of Debora's life that were never seen by the public. He thought about the quiet moments she had shared with her family, the way she had always taken the time to listen, even when her schedule was packed with deadlines. He remembered the late-night phone calls, when she would check in to make sure that everything was all right at home, the way she would make everyone laugh with her dry sense of humor, and the way she cared for those around her without ever asking for anything in return. In these private moments, Débora was not the confident, poised journalist the world knew. She was just a daughter, a sister, a friend, a person who, like anyone else, had her own struggles, her own insecurities, and her own doubts. Humberto remembered how, as a child, Débora had been so full of wonder, always asking questions about the world and wanting to know how things worked. She had been curious about everything, from the mechanics of a radio to the stories that people shared on the news. That insatiable curiosity had fueled her passion for communication, and it had driven her to achieve what she had in her career. But as much as she had achieved, Humberto also knew that Débora had always felt a sense of loneliness. The demands of her work had left her with little time for herself. As she climbed higher in her career, the pressure to succeed only intensified. Humberto had seen her struggle with the idea of living up to the expectations placed on her. Despite her success, there had always been a part of her that felt like she was constantly trying to prove something, not just to the world, but to herself. She had worked tirelessly, pouring everything she had into her job, and in doing so, had often put her own well-being on the back burner. There were times when she had spoken to her father about the pressure she faced, the weight of being a public figure, the constant scrutiny, and the fear of failure. But even then, she had never shown any sign of weakness. Instead, she had faced these challenges head-on, determined to rise above them. And when she had talked about her dream of learning to fly, Humberto had seen it as a metaphor, her desire to escape, to rise above the pressures that bound her. Little did he know that it was more than just a metaphor. It was a literal dream, one that she had begun to pursue in the final months of her life. As Humberto went through her belongings, he found notebooks filled with notes on aviation, routes she had studied, photos from her flying lessons. He found a piece of her that not many people knew about, the side of her that had dreamed of freedom, of taking flight in the most literal sense. It was a part of her that had always been there, tucked away beneath the surface, a quiet yearning for something more. Humberto marveled at her determination, at the way she had pursued this dream with the same fervor she had applied to her career. It was a reminder that, even in the face of everything she had achieved, Débora was still searching for something beyond her professional success. But it wasn't just her career and dreams that defined her. It was the way she had lived her life, the kindness she had shown to others, the quiet gestures of love that often went unnoticed. Humberto remembered the way Débora had cared for her family, how she had always made time to visit her mother and father, even when her schedule was packed. He remembered how, despite the fame and recognition, she had remained grounded, never letting it go to her head. She had always been there for those she loved, whether it was with a listening ear, a comforting word, or simply her presence. One of the most poignant memories Humberto had was of the last time they had spoken. It was just a few days before the tragedy when Débora had called him to say that she was going to take her first flight lesson. She had been so excited, so full of energy, that Humberto could hear the joy in her voice. He had congratulated her, proud of her for chasing her dreams, but he had also felt a pang of fear. He had always feared for her safety, as any parent would, but he had never imagined that his worst fear would become a reality so quickly. After her death, Humberto found himself replaying that conversation in his mind over and over. He thought about the way Débora had sounded, so alive, so full of hope. He thought about the way she had talked about the future, the things she wanted to accomplish, and how she had never stopped dreaming. And as he sat alone in his daughter's room, surrounded by her things, he realized just how much she had given to the world and how much she had kept to herself. In the silence that followed her passing, Humberto also found comfort in the fact that, despite everything, Débora had never stopped being herself. She had stayed true to her values, her beliefs, and her passions. And though her life had been cut short, her legacy would live on, not just in the stories she had told on television, but in the memories of those who had loved her, who had known her in a way that the world never could. Her legacy was not just about the work she had done, but about the way she had lived, the way she had inspired others to chase their dreams and live authentically. Humberto knew that he would carry the memory of his daughter with him for the rest of his life, not just as the journalist who had touched so many lives, but as the girl he had raised, the girl who had once asked him how radios worked, and who had gone on to change the world in her own quiet way. As Humberto sat quietly in the stillness of his home, the weight of Debora's absence became even more apparent. The world outside had continued, as it always does, but for those who loved her, life had irrevocably changed. Yet, as he reflected on her life, Humberto began to realize something that gave him a semblance of peace. Débora had left behind more than just a successful career. She had left behind a legacy. It wasn't just about the voice that had informed the nation, the face that had graced television screens, or the stories that she had so passionately told. It was about the person she had been, the ideals she had upheld, and the way she had lived her life, always with a fierce commitment to truth and integrity. Her death, tragic as it was, had also illuminated something profound. Humberto understood now that her legacy was not solely tied to her accomplishments, but to the way she had inspired others, especially those closest to her. It was in the way she had cared for her family, how she had remained humble despite her success, and how she had always stayed true to herself, even when the world demanded more. She had lived a life filled with ambition, yes, but also with heart. It was this balance, the harmony between her professional success and her personal values, that had made her so special. Her family, though devastated by her passing, found solace in the memories of the woman Débora had been before the cameras, before the fame. Humberto found comfort in the small, intimate moments he had shared with his daughter. The conversations in their living room, the quiet evenings spent together, the way she would curl up next to him after a long day, always looking for reassurance, even when she seemed so strong on the outside. Those were the moments that had shaped their bond, and those were the moments that would live on in his heart. Debora's desire to fly, the dream she had pursued in the final months of her life, was more than just an escape from the pressures of her career. It symbolized her inner strength, her determination to explore new horizons, and her willingness to embrace change. She had never been one to shy away from challenges, and her passion for aviation was just another example of how she had always strived for more. More learning, more discovery, more freedom. It was a testament to her character that, even at the height of her success, she had been open to new experiences, willing to grow and evolve. Humberto reflected on the conversations they had had about her love for flying. He had seen the excitement in her eyes as she spoke of the lessons she was taking, the joy she had found in learning something new. She had always been an open book when it came to her passions, and it was evident that flying had given her a sense of freedom that she hadn't felt in years. It was as if, through the act of learning to fly, she had found a way to break free from the constraints of her career, the expectations of others, and the pressures that had been placed on her shoulders. Her decision to pursue this dream, however, had not been fully understood by everyone around her. Humberto remembered how some of her colleagues had expressed surprise when they learned of her new hobby. To them, it seemed out of character for the woman who had always been so consumed with her work. But to Humberto, it made perfect sense. It was Deborah's way of reclaiming a part of herself, of finding balance in the chaos of her life. It was her way of staying grounded while simultaneously reaching for something greater. But even as she reached for the sky, the world below her remained a constant reminder of the pressures she faced. It was a paradox that Humberto could not escape. His daughter, the woman who had achieved so much, had been plagued by the same doubts and fears that many others face. She had struggled with the same pressures of perfection, the same feelings of inadequacy that so many of us grapple with, no matter how successful we appear on the outside. In the quiet moments after her death, Humberto found himself reflecting on the deeper questions that had always lingered in his mind. What was the cost of success? What had Deborah sacrificed to reach the heights she had attained? And, perhaps most painfully, had she ever truly been able to reconcile her ambition with her inner peace? The questions were too heavy to answer fully, but Humberto knew one thing for certain. Deborah had lived her life with a purpose. And that purpose had been driven not by fame or recognition, but by a genuine desire to make a difference, to leave a mark on the world in a way that was meaningful to her. As the days turned into weeks, Humberto began to see the impact of Deborah's legacy. It wasn't just in the accolades she had received or the tributes that poured in from her colleagues and fans. It was in the lives of those she had touched, her family, her friends, her colleagues, and even the strangers who had tuned in every day to hear her voice. The legacy she had left behind was one of integrity, passion, and a relentless pursuit of truth. It was a legacy that transcended her death, one that would continue to inspire others long after she was gone. In the end, Humberto realized that Deborah's life had not been defined by her death. It had been defined by the way she had lived. Her unwavering commitment to her values, her unshakable determination, and her willingness to push past obstacles had made her a force to be reckoned with. And though her life had been tragically short, it had been a life well lived, a life filled with purpose, passion, and a deep love for those around her. As time moved on, Humberto found himself still surrounded by Deborah's presence. Though her physical form was gone, her memory lingered in the spaces where she had once been, a living, breathing reminder of her legacy. The house, which had once been filled with her laughter and her quiet moments of introspection, now seemed to echo with an almost unbearable silence. Every morning, Humberto would sit at the kitchen table, the cup of coffee he had prepared for Deborah still sitting untouched. He didn't have the heart to throw it away. It was his way of holding on, of keeping her close, even if just for a little while longer. Her absence left a void that couldn't be filled. But in the midst of the grief, Humberto found that he had to let go, not just for himself, but for his daughter. The journey of mourning was not a linear path. It was jagged, unpredictable, and sometimes overwhelming. But in that journey, there was also healing. Humberto found solace in the quiet moments of reflection, in the stories he told about Deborah's life, the memories they had shared. He knew that these stories were his way of keeping her alive, of ensuring that the world would never forget the woman she had been. The pain of losing Débora was never fully gone. It didn't fade away over time, as some people might expect. Instead, it became a part of him, a part of his daily existence. Some days were better than others. There were moments when he could almost smile, thinking of the times they had spent together. But there were also days when the grief would hit him like a wave, unexpectedly overwhelming him with the weight of loss. But as the weeks turned into months, Humberto began to understand something he had never truly grasped before. Grief was not just about loss. It was about love. It was about the deep, unspoken connection that remained even after someone had passed. The love he had for Débora could never be extinguished. It was a force that would remain within him, tucked away in the corners of his heart. And in that love, Humberto found a way to keep moving forward. One day, while sorting through some of Debora's personal belongings, Humberto came across a notebook she had kept. It was filled with notes, thoughts, and ideas she had written down over the years. As he flipped through the pages, he came across one entry that caught his eye. It was a simple sentence. "If I ever leave, let it be because I'm following my dreams." Humberto paused for a moment, his heart heavy with emotion. It was as though Débora had known, in some way, that her time would come sooner than anyone could have expected. But even in her final moments, she had embraced life with a sense of purpose, following her dreams and doing what made her feel truly alive. Her love for flying, her desire to learn and grow, had been her way of breaking free from the confines of her career and her public life. It was a dream she had kept to herself, a private passion that she had pursued with all the dedication she had poured into everything else in her life. And in the end, it was that very dream that had led her to her untimely death. But Humberto understood now that Débora had never seen her dream as something that would separate her from the world. She had seen it as an expression of her freedom, her way of connecting with the world in a way that was uniquely her own. In that moment, Humberto realized that, in some strange way, Débora had lived the life she had wanted to live. She had never settled for anything less than what she truly desired. She had gone after her dreams with courage and passion, and in doing so, had inspired so many others to do the same. Her death, though heartbreaking, was not a reflection of a life unfulfilled. It was a reflection of a life lived fully, of a woman who had never stopped striving, never stopped pushing, and never stopped dreaming. As Humberto stood there, holding the notebook in his hands, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had always been proud of his daughter, but now, with the knowledge of everything she had endured, everything she had achieved, he was proud in a way that was deeper than he could ever express. She had fought battles that no one had ever seen, faced challenges that no one could understand, and yet she had always kept going, always kept moving forward. Humberto knew that he would carry the memory of Débora with him for the rest of his life. He would remember her not just as a journalist, but as the woman who had brought so much light into his life. Her love for life, her passion for her work, and her endless pursuit of her dreams would forever be a part of him. And as long as he lived, he would continue to honor her, to share her story, and to remember the woman who had taught him what it meant to truly live. As the years passed, Humberto's grief slowly transformed into something different, a quiet reverence for the woman his daughter had been. He would visit her grave, sometimes alone, sometimes with family, and he would sit there in the peaceful silence, remembering all the moments they had shared. And as he sat there, looking up at the sky, he would often feel a sense of connection to her, as if she was still with him, still flying high above. In the end, Humberto knew that Débora had left a mark on the world that could never be erased. She had given everything she had, and in return, she had left behind a legacy that would continue to inspire long after her death. And for him, that was enough.